October 20th, 1977 was a date that would forever echo through the halls of music history, but not for the reasons anyone had anticipated. Lynyrd Skynyrd, the Southern rock stars, had just dropped their game-changing album Street Survivors 3 days prior. Their star was shining bright as they took center stage at the Greenville Memorial Auditorium in Greenville, North Carolina. In the spotlight, they shone like never before, with iconic hits such as Sweet Home Alabama and Free Bird electrifying the audience. Lynyrd Skynyrd was soaring to new heights of fame, and a big American tour would follow. But behind the scenes, a chilling fate was closing in. Little did they know this would be the last time the founding members of the band would perform together. After Street Survivors hit the shelves on October 17th, Lynyrd Skynyrd started a big tour across America. Rather than relying on commercial flights or spending long hours on a tour bus, the band made the decision to rent a Convair CV-240 dual-prop airplane for their travel between concert venues. This choice allowed them to reach their destinations faster and easier, accommodating their busy touring schedule. Interestingly, just months prior, Aerosmith had considered renting the same airplane, but their management declined it due to safety concerns, especially after observing the pilot and co-pilot drinking from a bottle of Jack Daniels during an inspection, and this decision may have saved their lives. Following a concert in Lakeland, Florida, Lynyrd Skynyrd flew to Greenville, South Carolina for their next show on October 19th, 1977. During the flight, a 10-foot stream of sparks and flames shot from the plane's right engine. Some band members immediately raised concerns about the plane, even telling the lead singer, Ronnie Van Zant, that they would leave the tour unless they got a different aircraft. Cassie, the backup vocalist and sister of guitarist Steve Gaines, was so scared of the plane that she would rather travel in the band's cramped equipment truck instead. But Van Zant convinced her to board the plane. Switching planes meant canceling tour dates, something Van Zant strongly opposed. He believed the band couldn't just abandon their loyal Southern fans. They had to board that plane once again. Little did they know the fate that awaited them. On October 20th, after an electrifying concert in Greenville, the band members and crew boarded the 30-year-old airplane that would fly them to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. At the time, Lynyrd Skynyrd boasted a lineup featuring vocalist Ronnie Van Zant, guitarist Steve Gaines, Alan Collins and Gary Rossington, drummer Artemis Pyle, bassist Leon Wilkson, and keyboardist Billy Powell. In addition to these core members, the band was complemented by a trio of talented female backup singers, collectively known as the Honkettes. This trio consisted of Leslie Hawkins, JoJo Billingsley, and Cassie Gaines. As they boarded the plane, Van Zant was heard saying to Cassie, "If your time is up, your time is up," while he tried to reassure her. The band's next destination was Louisiana State University, where they were scheduled to perform the following night. The anticipation was high, and spirits were soaring as they took off. However, little did they know that this journey would take a tragic turn. On board of the plane were 26 passengers, including the band members, but only 20 would live to see another day. That night, the first stretch of the 700-mile flight to Baton Rouge was smooth sailing, but towards the end of their flight, the pilots made a startling realization. The aircraft was running low on fuel, and disaster was lurking. Suddenly, the right engine stopped functioning. This was the same engine that caused problems on the previous flight, and in a desperate attempt to transfer fuel from the left engine to the right, the flight crew accidentally jettisoned the remainder of their fuel into the atmosphere. Panic set in as they realized they didn't have enough fuel to make it to their destination. Desperation took over, and the pilots tried to change their course. They were aiming for the nearest airport, Macomb Pike Airport, just a few miles outside Macomb, Mississippi, but they soon faced a harsh reality. They didn't even have enough fuel to make it there. To make things even worse, at 10,000 feet and no fuel remaining, the left propeller also stopped working. The plane began to plummet, and this left them with no option but to attempt an emergency landing in an open field if they wanted any chance of surviving. Meanwhile, the passengers on board were completely unaware of the serious situation unfolding around them. Ronnie Van Zant was curled up with a pillow, sound asleep in the aisle at the back of the plane. He had been out partying the night before and desperately needed some rest. Other passengers were playing poker, trying to pass the time. It all seemed like a typical flight until the drummer, Artemis Pyle, decided to visit the cockpit and check on the flight crew. The moment he entered the cabin, a visibly panicked pilot named Walter McCreary urgently instructed him to return to his seat and buckle up. The severity of the situation became very clear and a feeling of anxiety quickly spread throughout the entire plane. Most passengers sat in stunned silence, closing their eyes and clenching their fists, while others prayed, hoping for a miracle. Guitarist Gary Rossington vividly remembered a chilling noise that sounded like hundreds of baseball bats hitting the outside of the plane as it began striking trees. They went past the intended landing area and were left with no choice but to crash into a swampy, wooded area. As they grazed the treetops for almost 1,000 feet, the noise got louder and louder until the plane came to a halt in a 3-foot-thick pine tree. The impact tore the plane completely apart in the 10 to 12 seconds it took to go from 100 miles per hour to a sudden stop. This force threw the passengers out of the plane and onto the forest ground. Rossington passed out during the crash, and when he regained consciousness several minutes later, he found himself on the ground with the plane's door on top of him. In his confused state, he looked at the scene and quickly realized that the plane was completely destroyed. The wings and tail had been torn off, and the cockpit, containing the deceased pilot, had separated completely. The plane had slid 500 feet after impact, leaving a trail of wreckage behind. In a strange twist of fate, the absence of fuel, which was the initial cause of the crash, turned out to be a blessing in disguise. It prevented the plane from bursting into flames upon impact, potentially saving many lives. However, despite the absence of fire, not all were lucky enough to survive. Long before that tragic flight, Ronnie Van Zant openly expressed a haunting belief that he wouldn't live to reach his 30th birthday. His father vividly remembered their conversations. He said to me many times, "Daddy, I'll never be 30 years old." I'd question him, "Why are you speaking this way? You won't make it to 30? And he'd always reply, "Daddy, that's my limit." His fellow band members were not immune to these unsettling predictions either. Drummer Artemis Pyle recalled a conversation they had in Tokyo, Japan. Ronnie told me that he would never live to see 30, and that he would go out with his boots on, in other words, on the road. I said, "Oh, Ronnie, don't talk like that," but the man knew his destiny. Even Ronnie's wife, Judy, had heard him speak of his looming fate so frequently that she couldn't dismiss it. She said, "When I heard that there had been a plane crash, I just knew Ronnie was one of the ones that didn't make it. He told me so many times that I realized that he really knew what he was talking about." And sadly, his premonition did indeed come true. 87 days before his 30th birthday, Ronnie Van Zant tragically lost his life in the devastating plane crash. He was violently thrown from his seat, hit his head against a compartment, and died immediately. However, the crash not only claimed the frontman Ronnie Van Zant, but also guitarist Steve Gaines, who died on impact, backing vocalist Cassie Gaines, who was thrown from the plane and died shortly after, the band's road manager, Dean Kilpatrick, who was found dead in a swamp, and the plane's 2 pilots, Walter McCreary and William Gray. While the majority of survivors were seated towards the rear of the plane, no one escaped without serious injuries. Keyboardist Billy Powell suffered severe injuries, including a nose that was nearly torn off and extensive facial and leg lacerations, nearly leading to fatal bleeding. Guitarist Gary Rossington broke both arms, both legs, both wrists, both ankles, and his pelvis. And drummer Artemis Pyle suffered multiple broken ribs in the crash. However, despite his injuries, Pyle somehow managed to navigate through a challenging terrain of a swampy creek and a dark field to reach a nearby farmhouse for help. It was getting dark, and there was a helicopter overhead searching for survivors, but since there was no fire, there was nothing to see. Pyle persevered, crossing a barbed wire fence, sustaining puncture wounds in the process. But as he approached the farmhouse, a man emerged with a rifle. The man yelled, "Halt!" But Pyle was in shock and stumbled forward. The farmer then shot him in the left shoulder, causing him to spin and fall. The impact spun him around and he collapsed, believing it might be his final moments. Gasping for breath, he managed to utter the words, "Plane crash." The farmer quickly rushed to assist, apologizing for the misunderstanding. He carried Pyle into his house, where a group of curious farm children gathered. Emergency responders swiftly arrived at the scene, rushing everyone to various hospitals. A local volunteer firefighter described the gruesome scene of the wreckage, mentioning that he stumbled over several victims who were still alive. At this chaotic moment, those whose lives were spared that day were not immediately informed of the tragic fatalities. Gary Rossington, for instance, remained unaware of Ronnie Van Zant's tragic passing for several days, only learning of it when his mother delivered the heartbreaking news. In the aftermath of the incident, the National Transportation Safety Board determined that the probable cause of this accident was fuel exhaustion and total loss of power from both engines due to crew inattention to fuel supply. Contributing to the fuel exhaustion were inadequate flight planning and an engine malfunction of undetermined nature in the right engine, which resulted in higher than normal fuel consumption. However, the NTSB clarified that the engine malfunction itself most likely wasn't that big a deal. Although examination of the engine and its components did not identify the exact discrepancy, the safety board believes that the discrepancy was of a general nature, such as an ignition or induction problem, and was not a major mechanical failure. Ultimately, the crash was attributed to crew inattention to fuel supply, according to the NTSB's final determination. Sadly, the band's tragic history didn't end there. In 1986, a devastating car accident left founding member and guitarist Alan Collins paralyzed, while his girlfriend tragically died on impact. Collins died on January 23, 1990 from chronic pneumonia, a complication of the paralysis. The band's bassist on the time of the crash, Leon Wilkson, was found dead in his hotel room on July 27, 2001. His passing was attributed to emphysema and chronic liver disease, adding to the band's list of losses. In 2009, keyboardist Billy Powell passed away after a heart attack. The original Lynyrd Skynyrd reached its conclusion when Gary Rossington, the last remaining original member, sadly passed away on March 5, 2023. The cause of his death was not disclosed. However, he had a history of heart disease. With over 60 albums produced, which have sold over 30 million copies worldwide, Rock and Roll Hall of Famers Lynyrd Skynyrd remain music icons that appeal to all generations. If you found this video informative or thought-provoking, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on more tragic stories.